October 1988, Monrovia, California, a quiet neighborhood east of Los Angeles, framed by the San Gabriel Mountains. Morning light fell across a two-story home on Cypress Avenue. Inside, silence lingered longer than usual. A neighbor, preparing for work, noticed the mail uncollected and the porch light still burning. Hours passed. By noon, a family friend walked to the front door. The lock resisted. When police arrived, the door creaked softly as it opened. Inside, the air was cold and still. Detectives found a scene that would stay with them for decades. A young woman, 27 years old, had been killed inside her own home. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing seemed stolen. Her name was Angela Reyes, a teacher known in the neighborhood for her quiet kindness and the small garden she kept by the window. The investigation began immediately. Officers cordoned off the street as curious residents watched from behind curtains. A police radio crackled in the distance. The department's crime scene unit documented everything: photographs, fingerprints, fibers. In 1988, DNA testing was still in its infancy. Evidence was collected, but much of it would remain sealed in envelopes for years. By sunset, local news stations reported the homicide. The anchor's voice carried a tone of disbelief. Violent crime was rare in that part of Monrovia. Reporters described it as a puzzling and senseless act. Detectives interviewed neighbors who had heard faint footsteps around midnight. Others recalled a car idling nearby. No one could identify the driver. That night, the city seemed to hold its breath. Police presence was heavy along the narrow streets, flashlights cutting through the dark. The investigation, though urgent, yielded little. Early leads faded quickly. Angela's family arrived from Riverside the following morning. They stood outside the taped doorway as officers worked inside. Her mother, a retired nurse, asked quietly for her daughter's wedding ring. It was missing. Detectives noted the detail but found no immediate link to robbery. Within a week, the case drew regional attention. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department offered assistance, pooling forensic specialists to process trace evidence. Detectives examined every known contact: colleagues, friends, former partners. No one had motive, and no fingerprints matched anyone in their database. Angela's last known activity was logged at 8:14 p.m., a phone call to a coworker confirming she would drop off lesson plans the next morning. She never arrived. The file, labeled Homicide 88-11-27, became part of Monrovia Police Department's active investigations. But as months passed, it moved quietly toward the back of the shelf. Her case joined hundreds of unsolved homicides across Los Angeles County at the end of the 1980s. Forensic science was limited by available technology. Evidence could not yet reveal what modern methods could later expose. Still, detectives preserved it carefully, a decision that would one day prove decisive. The neighborhood changed, but the house remained. Over time, new residents moved in, unaware of what had happened within its walls. Yet the story never left the small circle of those who knew her. Her brother continued writing letters to the department each year, asking if anything new had surfaced. The replies stayed the same: no further developments at this time. By the early 2000s, the file was considered cold. It rested inside a gray cabinet in evidence storage, sealed and dated. Dust gathered on the label. Few expected it would ever reopen. 3 decades later, advances in forensic analysis would change everything. A single preserved evidence bag, overlooked by time, held the key. But in 1988, that future remained unimaginable. The photograph taken at the scene had faded slightly, colors drained by years of exposure. In its sunlight crossed the window pane, landing on a half-open book beside the chair. That image, quiet and ordinary, became a silent reminder of an unfinished story. This was not a headline case, nor a national scandal. It was one life lost, one family waiting for answers, and a police department holding a mystery it could not yet solve. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. The days after Angela Reyes's death unfolded with methodical precision. Detectives documented every detail of the home, logging each item into the evidence ledger. The living room showed no sign of struggle. A mug of tea rested half full on the table. The clock on the wall had stopped at 12:42 a.m. Cold air drifted from a window left slightly ajar, Investigators noted the absence of forced entry. Whoever entered the home likely knew her or had been invited in. The locks were intact, and there was no sign of pried doors or shattered glass. Her car remained parked outside, keys on the kitchen counter. Detectives concluded that the encounter turned violent unexpectedly, a confrontation between familiarity and betrayal. Crime scene technicians photographed the area, using film cameras and flash attachments. Each image was printed, labeled, and placed into a binder. Blood samples were collected using cotton swabs and sealed in glass vials. A fingernail scraping was preserved in a small envelope. The term DNA profiling appeared only once in the report, a new technology not yet accessible to local departments without state-level support. The coroner's report listed cause of death as blunt force trauma. Time of death was estimated between midnight and 1 a.m. Toxicology found no foreign substances. Her last meal, a small serving of rice and vegetables, suggested she had been home alone that night. There were no defensive wounds, indicating a swift, unexpected attack. Detectives began with the inner circle. Colleagues described Angela as punctual, organized, and reserved. She lived alone but maintained close contact with her parents and brother. Her principal confirmed she had recently been offered a promotion to curriculum coordinator. Coworkers recalled no conflicts. Her phone records showed several calls on the evening before her death, a brief conversation with her mother, a routine call to the school office, and one unreturned call to a number listed under a M. Lawson. The name was unfamiliar to investigators. When traced, it belonged to a former classmate she had known in college. He lived 40 miles away and confirmed that she had called regarding a volunteer tutoring program they once ran together. He was ruled out quickly. By early November, detectives compiled a suspect list based on proximity and routine. Neighbors were interviewed again. One resident, 2 houses down, mentioned a man seen standing near Angela's driveway several evenings in a row earlier that month. She described him as tall, wearing a dark jacket. The sighting lacked detail, but prompted canvassing of nearby businesses. Surveillance cameras were rare, and few leads emerged. In 1988, background checks required in-person requests and mailed forms. Detectives spent days visiting local offices, cross-referencing criminal records. The Monrovia Police Department partnered with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office to conduct neighborhood patrols in case the assailant lingered nearby. As the investigation deepened, media attention waned. Without new developments, headlines shifted elsewhere. The case remained open, but resources grew limited. Detectives continued interviewing anyone with connection to Angela, though no pattern emerged. Her family organized a small vigil in early December. Candlelight flickered against the cold night air. The service was brief. Her brother spoke quietly about her commitment to teaching and her belief that kindness could change lives. The community attended, though few knew her personally. By the first anniversary, the case file filled 2 binders. Detectives had logged nearly 100 witness statements. None led to a clear suspect. Frustration grew within the department. The lead investigator, Sergeant Thomas Carter, requested assistance from the Los Angeles County Cold Case Division, but the case did not yet meet their criteria. It was too recent. Years passed. Evidence storage expanded, and unsolved homicides were archived by decade. Angela's file was boxed and labeled with red tape, marked pending reevaluation. It joined rows of similar boxes stacked in a temperature-controlled facility. The air inside was dry, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the room. In the 1990s, DNA testing advanced rapidly. The FBI launched the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, creating the first national database for genetic profiles. Monrovia's department, like many small jurisdictions, lacked funding to reprocess older evidence. Samples remained sealed, awaiting a future with better tools. Her parents continued sending letters to the department annually. Each one was carefully logged in the case file. Officers responded with courtesy, explaining that evidence had been preserved and that technological progress might one day bring answers. For the family, those replies became a fragile form of hope. By 1997, new detectives had rotated into the homicide unit. Some reviewed cold files between active investigations. Angela's case surfaced briefly that year, but resource limits again stalled testing. The report noted, Evidence remains viable pending future forensic development. Her brother, now raising a family of his own, began keeping a personal archive. Newspaper clippings, letters, photographs. He visited the station every few years, meeting whoever was assigned to the cold case desk. Each visit ended with the same promise: "We'll keep it open." The home on Cypress Avenue changed ownership twice in the following decade. New paint covered the walls and the garden was replanted. Yet longtime residents still referred to it quietly as the Reyes house. For some, the memory faded. For others, it lingered like a shadow on the street. Local police used the case occasionally for training purposes, teaching recruits about proper evidence preservation. In one recorded session from 2005, instructors emphasized the importance of maintaining chain of custody. Angela's case served as a textbook example of why careful storage mattered. The next generation of investigators entered a field transformed by technology. DNA sequencing, once experimental, became standard. Techniques like mitochondrial DNA analysis could extract profiles from samples previously considered unusable. Across the country, cold cases once dormant began to reopen. In Monrovia, a small task force reviewed unsolved homicides with preserved biological evidence. Angela's case, with multiple sealed samples and complete documentation, met the new criteria. The evidence box was retrieved from storage. Dust in the air caught the beam of a flashlight as the seal was inspected. Inside lay envelopes labeled in careful handwriting: fingernail scraping, clothing fibers, swab, table surface. Each item represented a potential answer that technology could now unlock. By that time, many of the original investigators had retired. The cold case was reassigned to Detective Laura Mendoza, a veteran with 20 years in forensic analysis. Her focus was methodical. She ordered a full inventory of all materials and submitted a request to the Los Angeles County Crime Lab for DNA extraction. Samples were transported under strict chain of custody procedures, documented, sealed, logged. In the sterile lab environment, technicians began processing them. Forensic equipment hummed quietly as profiles were generated. The data would soon be compared against the National CODIS database. But before results returned, Mendoza reopened the original reports. She read through hundreds of pages of notes, maps, and witness statements. Patterns began to emerge, small inconsistencies that earlier investigators may have overlooked. A neighbor's timeline conflicted with another's. A name mentioned only once in 1988 appeared again in a 91 follow-up call. A man who had moved out of state. Shortly after the incident, the new analysis, combined with DNA technology, would finally shift the case toward resolution. But in 1988 and for many years after, the sense of uncertainty was constant. In that first year, detectives worked tirelessly, documenting every piece of evidence, hoping one detail might stand out. The technology wasn't there yet, but the care they took ensured that decades later, truth could still be found. Outside the station, the evening wind pressed against the glass. Files were locked away, lights turned off, and the building fell quiet. In that silence, the investigation remained, paused, but never forgotten. When the Monrovia Police Department's Cold Case Task Force reopened Angela Reyes's file in 2018, it had been 30 years since the original investigation. The evidence box was lifted from storage with care, its label faded but still legible. Inside, the documentation remained intact, an uncommon preservation for a case that old Detective Laura Mendoza began her review in quiet isolation. Her desk was small, the overhead light dim. She spread the reports in chronological order, tracing every lead that had once gone cold. The first goal was to identify what evidence could still yield biological material for DNA profiling. The fingernail scrapings, the swabs from the table surface, and the small piece of cloth from her blouse became priorities. At the Los Angeles County Regional Crime Laboratory, forensic analysts used advanced extraction methods that did not exist in 1988. Even degraded samples could now produce partial genetic profiles. Machines processed material overnight, their steady hum filling the sterile space. Technicians logged every stage, ensuring chain of custody remained unbroken. The first viable result came from the fingernail sample. A partial male DNA profile emerged, though incomplete. Analysts confirmed it was consistent with physical contact, possibly during struggle. Further processing using YSTR amplification, a technique isolating male-specific markers, produced a near-complete sequence. It was immediately uploaded to CODIS. The database search began in mid-June 2018. Within hours, the system generated no direct match, not unusual for older profiles. But the data was retained for potential familial searches, a method that compared partial genetic similarities to relatives of known offenders. It was a sensitive tool, legally restricted but powerful. The request for familial comparison was filed through the California Department of Justice. Meanwhile, Mendoza revisited original witness statements. She visited the same neighborhood, now changed by decades of development. Houses had been remodeled, and most original residents had moved away. A few long-term neighbors still remembered the event. One recalled a rumor from the early 1990s that someone connected to the victim had left town suddenly. The detail matched earlier notes about a man named Victor Reyes, a former coworker who had briefly worked at the same school. Reyes's name appeared twice in the early reports. He was interviewed in 1988 but not considered a suspect. At the time, his alibi placed him in San Diego visiting relatives. No corroborating statements were recorded. The detail was marked verified by phone, an informal confirmation that would not meet modern investigative standards. Mendoza requested Reyes's employment history and background. Records showed he had relocated to Arizona in 1990 and held various jobs. There were no criminal charges. However, when cross-checked with national databases, his name appeared in a 2003 misdemeanor assault case, dismissed, but fingerprint data collected. The print record provided a potential bridge between historical evidence and modern databases. Forensic comparison between the fingerprint recovered from Angela's home, lifted from a glass surface in 1988, and Reyes's archived print yielded inconclusive results. The older, latent print lacked sufficient ridge detail for full identification. Still, Mendoza noted it as circumstantial consistency. Weeks later, the Department of Justice approved the familial DNA request. The partial YSTR profile from the fingernail sample matched closely with a known entry: a man convicted in 2010 for burglary in San Bernardino County. The match was not direct. It indicated a close male relative. That relative was traced to the Reyes family. Investigators built a genealogical profile using public databases, constructing a family tree that traced multiple generations. The approach mirrored methods that had recently solved several high-profile cold cases across California. Analysts used both autosomal and Y-chromosomal comparisons, narrowing possibilities to a small group of male relatives. Surveillance records confirmed that Victor Reyes, now 59, still lived in Arizona. He had maintained a low profile working as a contractor. Detectives coordinated with the Arizona Department of Public Safety to obtain a discarded DNA sample legally. In July 2019, plainclothes officers followed Reyes to a gas station in Phoenix. After he discarded a coffee cup, it was retrieved under chain of custody protocol. The cup was sealed, labeled, and transported to the lab. DNA extraction confirmed a full match to the profile derived from the 1988 evidence. Probability of random match, less than 1 in 1 trillion. Detective Mendoza read the result in silence. It was the confirmation decades of work had sought. She prepared the arrest warrant and coordinated with Arizona authorities. Before the arrest, investigators reconstructed Reyes's connection to Angela. Both had worked briefly at the same elementary school in Duarte. He had been an assistant maintenance worker, later dismissed for misconduct. Records showed minor disputes between staff and Reyes regarding inappropriate comments. Angela had filed a complaint, though the report was lost when the school merged with another district. When confronted in Phoenix, Reyes appeared startled but calm. He denied knowing Angela beyond passing encounters. Detectives presented the DNA evidence, explaining that his genetic material was recovered from under her fingernails. He requested an attorney and refused further comment. Following extradition to California, prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder under special circumstances. Murder during a burglary, though theft was never proven. The charge reflected the entry into the home and physical evidence suggesting confrontation. Throughout the renewed investigation, Mendoza documented every procedural step. Each sample transfer, lab result, and interview was logged meticulously. The cold case unit used digital evidence management software, ensuring that no document would ever again be misplaced. As the case gained momentum, local media revisited the story. News anchors referenced a 30-year mystery solved by DNA. The coverage was brief but respectful. For Angela's family, the news brought a mix of relief and disbelief. They had waited half a lifetime. Her brother met Mendoza at the department headquarters in August 2019. He brought with him a folder, yellowed pages, handwritten notes, copies of every letter. He asked whether his sister had fought back. The detective nodded gently, saying the evidence indicated she had resisted. The DNA under her nails proved it. That confirmation carried a heavy silence. In the months following the arrest, forensic experts continued validating the chain of evidence. Independent testing confirmed identical results. The defense's motion to suppress DNA evidence, citing degradation, was denied after laboratory analysts testified to the preservation integrity. As case materials moved toward trial, additional background checks uncovered a minor but significant pattern. Reyes had been questioned in connection with another unsolved assault in 1987, involving a woman who survived. That incident occurred less than 3 miles from Angela's home. The report, never linked until now, described a similar method of approach: entry without force, sudden attack, and flight. That victim had described her attacker vaguely as a man she recognized from work grounds. The connection reinforced prosecutors' theory of premeditated targeting rather than random violence. Forensic comparison between the 1987 case evidence and the current DNA profile was underway. Even if statutes of limitation had expired for older offenses, the pattern supported motive and identification. Inside the department, the reopening of Angela's case revitalized attention to other dormant files. Detectives revisited their archives, recognizing that technology could continue reshaping outcomes once thought impossible. The cold case unit expanded, and state grants funded additional testing. The investigation also drew attention to the critical importance of evidence preservation. Many departments in the 1980s had lacked resources for long-term storage, leading to loss or contamination of materials. Monrovia's case file had survived primarily due to procedural thoroughness. A retired evidence clerk, interviewed by local media, explained that she had insisted on retaining every scrap from homicide cases. Her diligence, unnoticed for decades, had quietly preserved justice. As the trial date approached, investigators reconstructed the likely sequence of events from that October night. Forensic analysis showed that Reyes had likely entered through the unlocked side door. Fibers from his jacket matched partial fibers found near the entryway. No valuables were taken, suggesting personal motive. The confrontation may have stemmed from prior tension at work, resentment after disciplinary action. Re-examined fingerprints placed him inside the living room. Advances in digital imaging allowed analysts to enhance partial prints recovered in 1988. The ridge characteristics matched Reyes's known fingerprints with high probability. The prosecution's narrative formed steadily. A calculated visit, confrontation, and assault. When Angela resisted, he struck her fatally. His flight left minimal trace, but the smallest remnants, microscopic cells, endured. Throughout the renewed investigation, the tone remained factual and restrained. There were no dramatic announcements or public declarations. The work was deliberate, driven by documentation and precision. In late 2019, Reyes was transferred to Los Angeles County Jail, awaiting trial. The courthouse prepared for proceedings under modern evidentiary standards. Angela's family, after decades of uncertainty, began to prepare themselves for testimony. The investigative process that had once halted in frustration now concluded with scientific certainty. 30 years earlier, detectives had relied on sketches, interviews, and instinct. Now, molecules carried the truth. At the close of the investigative phase, Detective Mendoza wrote in her final report, "Preservation is patience. Every sealed envelope is a promise of answers yet to come." Outside, evening descended over the station. the sound of distant traffic mixed with the faint hum of air conditioning. Inside the evidence room, the old boxes remained, each one marked with a name, a date, and hope that one day another story might find closure. For Angela Reyes' family, the 30 years between 1988 and 2018 had passed in quiet endurance. Her parents aged within the same riverside home, where her childhood photographs still hung in narrow frames along the hallway. Each November, they lit a small candle by her picture. The flame burned until morning, marking another year without answers. Heavy silence filled the house once the light went out. Her brother, Daniel, had grown from a young man into a father of two. For most of his adult life, he carried the burden of not knowing. He worked as a postal carrier, walking the same streets each day, routine masking the weight he carried. Whenever an unsolved crime made local headlines, he wrote again to the Monrovia Police Department, asking if his sister's case might finally move forward. The family never pursued media attention. They kept their grief private, channeling it into quiet persistence. Angela's mother passed away in 2006, never knowing the case would one day be solved. Her father followed 4 years later, when Detective Mendoza called Daniel in 2019 with the DNA confirmation. He sat for a long time before speaking. He later said the words he managed were simple. "Thank you for not giving up." For the community, the reopening of the case stirred distant memories. Residents who had lived in Monrovia during the late 1980s recalled the atmosphere of unease after the crime. For weeks, people double-checked their locks and avoided walking alone at night. The story faded with time, but when news broke of the arrest, many described a strange sense of relief, like something unfinished had quietly closed. Local newspapers revisited their archives, publishing side-by-side photographs, Angela in a classroom, smiling faintly, and the suspect's modern mugshot. The contrast was striking. Youth and potential against the passage of decades. Comments beneath the articles reflected a subdued empathy. Readers expressed respect for the detectives who persisted, and sorrow for the family who had waited so long. At the school where Angela once taught, staff gathered for a small memorial assembly. Most had not known her personally, but administrators shared her story as part of a reflection on safety and community resilience. A plaque bearing her name was placed in the courtyard garden. On its surface, sunlight fell through the branches of a nearby tree. Students walked past without speaking, but teachers paused briefly in acknowledgement. In interviews, former colleagues described her as patient and calm. One recalled that Angela often stayed late to prepare lessons for struggling students. Another remembered her soft voice during morning greetings. These memories, preserved through decades, offered glimpses of a life interrupted but not forgotten. The city itself had changed. Where once there were small shops and narrow streets, new buildings stood. Yet for those who remembered, the case symbolized both loss and endurance. City officials later acknowledged the persistence of the Monrovia Police Department's cold case unit, recognizing the detectives who ensured that evidence was never discarded. Among the officers who had worked the original case, some were still alive to see its resolution. Retired Sergeant Thomas Carter, then in his 80s, spoke briefly to a local reporter. His words were measured. "We did what we could with what we had. I'm grateful they kept the file." The interview ended with him glancing at the old case photo. Dust in the air shimmered in the studio lights. For Angela's family, the arrest brought complex emotions. Relief mixed with renewed grief. Closure did not erase the loss. It simply gave it a defined edge. Daniel attended court hearings quietly, sitting several rows behind the prosecution. When reporters asked for comment, he declined. His focus remained on seeing the process through to its conclusion. The community response remained respectful. Online forums discussing the case emphasized the importance of forensic technology and the ethics of genetic genealogy. Some debated privacy concerns, while others viewed it as a vital tool for justice. For Daniel, the conversation meant little. For him, the science had given voice to his sister after decades of silence. As media coverage spread, a few former Monrovia residents reached out to authorities, providing forgotten memories from the time. One recalled that Hayes had occasionally lingered near the school parking lot after his dismissal. Another mentioned he had made unsettling remarks about certain teachers. These recollections, while anecdotal, reinforced what investigators already believed, that Angela had been specifically targeted. In the months leading to trial, the family began preparing impact statements. Prosecutors explained they would have an opportunity to address the court after conviction. Daniel struggled to write his. He spent evenings reading through old letters his mother had written to the department. The paper smelled faintly of age and dust. Each letter ended the same way. Please don't forget her. For many in Monrovia, the case became a reminder of patience and preservation. City officials later organized a community forum on cold case investigations. Angela's former students, now adults, shared memories online. One described how she had helped him learn to read after he transferred mid-year. Another remembered her giving extra lunch tickets to children who forgot theirs. Their recollections, small but specific, painted a clearer image of who she was beyond the case file. Her brother eventually created a scholarship fund in her name, aimed at supporting education majors at a local university. The fund's mission was modest: one annual award, selected for dedication rather than academic ranking. Each year, the university sent him the recipient's name and a handwritten note of thanks. Those letters joined the growing collection in his folder. During court proceedings, Daniel often sat near the aisle, watching as detectives entered and exited. He greeted Mendoza once before testimony began, offering a quiet handshake. She later said that moment carried more weight than any commendation. The public interest remained steady, but restrained. The case never became sensationalized. Coverage remained factual, focusing on technological breakthroughs and procedural diligence. The calm tone mirrored the nature of the channel that would one day retell it: deliberate, investigative, and respectful. For Monrovia's officers, the outcome reinforced the long view of justice. Cases might grow cold, but with time and precision, evidence can still speak. Several detectives joined state conferences afterward, presenting the case as an example of persistence and protocol. Their emphasis was clear: chain of custody preserved truth across generations. The community's trust in law enforcement, shaken decades earlier by unsolved violence, quietly strengthened. Residents recognized that patience, though painful, could eventually yield resolution. When the trial date was announced, Angela's remaining relatives gathered once more in Riverside. They met at their parents' old home, the rooms largely unchanged. The photograph on the hallway wall had faded slightly, edges curled from sunlight. Daniel replaced the frame with a new one, then sat at the table where his family once shared Sunday meals. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the window pane. He reflected on how much time had passed. 3 decades, entire lives lived in the shadow of unanswered questions. The arrest had not erased pain, but it had restored balance to a story that once seemed unfinished. The years between 1990 and 2018 moved quietly. Angela's name appeared only once every few years in departmental summaries. A brief mention under cold case status, pending review. The file sat in a metal drawer at the back of the evidence archive. Fluorescent lights flickered above the shelves, and the air carried the faint smell of paper and disinfectant. Each new detective assigned to the homicide division inherited the file, read it, and placed it back again. Some wrote marginal notes in blue ink, considered DNA testing when funding available. Others left initials beside the evidence log, acknowledging its presence. None could move it forward. By the late 1990s, digital record-keeping began replacing typewritten reports. Many older files were scanned, but Angela's case remained physical, original pages in plastic sleeves. The evidence box was heavier than most, containing photographs, cassette recordings of interviews, and sealed envelopes. Tape hissed faintly when one of the old interview cassettes was played during review. The voices were formal, cautious, reflecting an era before forensic precision defined investigation. For the family, time became repetition. Each year, Daniel phoned the department on the anniversary week. The response never changed. The case was still open, still unsolved. Over time, his calls grew shorter, less frequent, though he never stopped entirely. Technology advanced elsewhere. DNA databases expanded, and high-profile cold cases across the country began to find resolution through genetic evidence. Each solved case gave the family new hope, followed by renewed disappointment when their own remained untouched. The gap between progress and their reality felt vast. Detectives rotated out of the unit. Budgets shifted toward active cases. Angela's name appeared less and less in internal memos. For years, her file gathered a thin layer of dust, untouched except during periodic audits. Occasionally, journalists revisiting regional cold cases would mention hers in brief lists. Monrovia, 1988, unresolved. No article ever explored it in depth. Without new information, the story remained dormant. Inside the evidence vault, humidity controls kept the environment stable. Each box bore a barcode and label. When maintenance crews checked the shelves annually, they logged the Reyes file as secure. The procedural care was impersonal but essential. That integrity would preserve the DNA long enough for science to catch up. The mid-2000s brought another round of departmental changes. Old paper logs were digitized, though not all made the transfer. Several reports from the late 1980s were scanned at low resolution, text blurred around the edges. Still, the original copies remained stored, sealed with red tape. In 2010, the department received a grant to establish a dedicated cold case review team. Initial efforts focused on high-visibility cases with available DNA profiles. Angela's file was evaluated but deferred due to incomplete sample analysis from earlier testing. The report read simply, "Sample viability uncertain." By then, Daniel had moved out of California. He continued writing letters on anniversaries, each more concise than the last. The tone changed from pleading to measured patience. "We understand resources are limited," one note read, "but we ask that her case not be forgotten." The decades of silence were not marked by neglect, but by limitation. Technology, funding, and priority had not yet converged. The evidence waited, inert but intact. Each small administrative act, labeling, sealing, archiving, preserved its potential. Forensic science had evolved beyond recognition. Yet each advancement seemed just out of reach for local departments constrained by cost. By 2015, statewide initiatives began encouraging the re-examination of unsolved homicides with biological material. Monrovia submitted a preliminary list. Among those listed, Case 88-1127. The designation carried no emotion, only numbers and dates. But for one family, it represented decades of absence. The silence was not empty. It was filled with quiet persistence. The daily work of officers preserving evidence they could not yet use. The steady hum of machines maintaining temperature. The family's letters arriving once a year without fail. Outside, the city changed. Streets were repaved, businesses replaced, new families moved in. Few remembered what had happened on Cypress Avenue in 1988. Yet behind the concrete walls of the police archive, the evidence box remained exactly as it had been packed 30 years earlier. When the box was finally retrieved in 2018, the seal broke with a soft crack. Inside, the paper labels still bore handwritten notes in fading ink. The envelopes were fragile but unbroken. Technicians logged them again, scanning barcodes into a modern digital system. The past met the present quietly, without ceremony. The silence that had stretched across 3 decades ended not with a discovery in the field, but with a laboratory machine reading traces invisible to the human eye. Years of stillness gave way to movement. But before that moment, the case existed only as memory. A file number, a faded photograph, and a family waiting for a call that never came. Dust in the air caught the light as the evidence clerk placed the box onto the stainless steel counter. The hum of refrigeration units echoed faintly through the storage room. Justice had waited 30 years in the quiet. In February 2018, the Monrovia Police Department's cold case review program reached the Reyes file. The assignment came almost by routine. Each analyst was given several inactive cases to assess for potential DNA relevance. When Detective Laura Mendoza opened the box, she did not expect much. But inside, she found a meticulous evidence log. Every seal intact, every item labeled. She set the envelopes on the stainless steel table beneath fluorescent light. Dust in the air shimmered faintly. Among them, one small envelope caught her attention. It was labeled fingernail scrapings, victim. Inside lay the oldest yet most promising clue. In the controlled environment of the Los Angeles County Regional Crime Laboratory, Technicians began their work. They wore gloves, masks, and face shields. Using micro-extraction methods, they separated biological material from contamination. Machines operated in near silence except for the low mechanical rhythm of centrifuges. The first DNA fragments began to appear on screen days later. Degraded, incomplete but genuine. The sample contained a male genetic profile, partial but sufficient for advanced comparison. Analysts performed YSTR testing, isolating the male-specific chromosome patterns. It was a complex process, one that 1980s investigators could never have imagined. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, where millions of records waited for alignment. No direct hit appeared. The system logged the sample for future matching. But Mendoza, aware of emerging genealogical techniques, requested a secondary analysis through familial search. This approach compared partial DNA similarities to potential relatives of known offenders. At the time, the results returned 3 months later. A potential link emerged, a partial familial match to a man convicted of burglary in 2010, whose surname was Reyes. Investigators traced the family tree through public records and genealogical databases. The lineage pointed toward one branch, one individual. Victor Reyes, age 59, residing in Phoenix, Arizona. Mendoza reviewed the 1988 reports again. The name appeared twice in early notes, referenced briefly during workplace interviews. Reyes had been a maintenance assistant at the school where Angela taught. He had been disciplined for inappropriate behavior, then dismissed. In 1988, he told investigators he had moved to San Diego that weekend. His statement was accepted without verification. Now, 3 decades later, that oversight resurfaced. Working with the Arizona Department of Public Safety, Mendoza obtained legal clearance for a covert DNA collection. The procedure followed precise legal protocol. No intrusion, no contact. Surveillance officers observed Reyes over several days. On June 3, 2019, he stopped for coffee at a Phoenix gas station. After finishing, he discarded his paper cup into a public bin. Officers retrieved it moments later, sealed it in a sterile container, and logged the chain of custody. The sample was shipped to the Los Angeles County lab. Within a week, analysts confirmed a full genetic match, identical to the male DNA recovered from under Angela's fingernails. Statistical certainty exceeded 1 in 1 trillion. When the result printed, Mendoza sat for several minutes in silence. The report was brief. 1 page, a table of allele markers, a single line at the bottom. Match confirmed. She called the district attorney's office and requested an immediate warrant for arrest. On the morning of June 24, 2019, officers in unmarked vehicles positioned themselves outside Reyes' single-story home in Phoenix. The street was quiet, early sunlight reflecting off car hoods. As Reyes stepped outside carrying a trash bag, officers approached. He complied without resistance. A neighbor watching from across the street later described the scene simply. No shouting, no struggle. Reyes was booked at Maricopa County Jail pending extradition to California. Detectives interviewed him in a recorded session. The room was plain, the air conditioning low. Mendoza read him his rights. Reyes maintained calm, denied involvement, and stated he had not seen Angela since 1988. When confronted with the DNA evidence, he paused but said only, "That's not possible." The statement was entered into record, following standard protocol. His DNA was recollected through buccal swab to confirm identity. The second test matched perfectly. The scientific consistency eliminated any claim of contamination. As news spread, local outlets covered the arrest. Headlines read, "Monrovia cold case solved after 30 years, DNA links former coworker." The coverage remained factual, avoiding speculation. Reporters noted the growing role of forensic genealogy in modern justice. At the department, the mood was subdued, but resolute. Detectives and technicians who had handled the evidence years earlier were notified. Retired Sergeant Carter received a phone call from Mendoza. His voice, faint with age, carried gratitude. "I'm glad you kept her file alive," he said. Prosecutors began constructing the case. Evidence consisted primarily of DNA, fingerprints, and circumstantial workplace history. The absence of physical witnesses made the forensic integrity crucial. Each stage of collection from 1988 to 2019 was presented as unbroken chain of custody. Forensic analysts testified to the storage conditions, temperature-controlled, sealed, unaltered. Their statements were supported by documentation spanning decades. The defense filed motions challenging DNA reliability due to sample age. Expert testimony dismissed the claims, explaining that preservation methods from the 1980s had maintained sample viability. Meanwhile, detectives reviewed archived administrative files from the school district. Among them, a disciplinary memorandum from 1987 surfaced, describing Hayes's conduct toward staff members. The record included Angela's written statement, brief but clear. "He made me uncomfortable. I reported it." That paper, long misplaced, became vital evidence establishing motive and connection. Investigators reconstructed the likely sequence of events on the night of October 27, 1988. Hayes, familiar with the layout of Angela's home from previous visits to deliver maintenance supplies, arrived unannounced. Entry was achieved through an unlocked side door. No signs of forced entry supported this theory. A confrontation occurred in the living room. Forensic mapping showed impact points consistent with struggle. Angela's DNA was later found on a small fragment of Hayes's jacket, recovered during a search of his old storage unit in Arizona. When confronted with this evidence, Hayes remained silent. His attorney advised against further questioning. The arrest marked the end of 3 decades of uncertainty for Angela's family. Daniel received the call from Mendoza personally. He later described her tone as steady, factual, and kind. "We have a match," she said. "We're bringing him home." He sat at his kitchen table for a long time after the call, listening to the quiet of the house. Outside, the refrigerator hummed softly. As the case proceeded toward trial, prosecutors consulted forensic specialists who detailed the advancements that made identification possible. They explained how minuscule genetic fragments, when preserved correctly, could reveal complete profiles decades later. The courtroom would eventually hear the same explanation, demonstrating how science had become the voice of the victim. Within law enforcement circles, the Reyes case became an example of procedural patience. Many departments across the state requested copies of Monrovia's preservation guidelines. Conferences cited the case as evidence of the necessity of long-term storage funding. In interviews, Mendoza downplayed her role. "It's not about credit," she said. "It's about continuity. We're just caretakers until technology catches up." Behind her words was the unspoken acknowledgement that most cold cases never reach resolution. Each solved case represented not just science but also endurance, a department that never discarded evidence, a family that never stopped asking. The arrest did not end the investigation. Prosecutors continued tracing Hayes's movements from 1988 onward. They discovered he had lived intermittently across Southern California before moving to Arizona. Employment records showed irregular gaps, including months unaccounted for. The timeline was reconstructed with the precision of forensic auditing. Every address, every job application, every state crossing was mapped. In mid-2020, Hayes was transferred to Los Angeles County for pretrial hearings. The transport took place at dawn under minimal media attention. Inside the secure vehicle, he remained quiet. The route followed Interstate 10, the same corridor connecting his old and new lives. Upon arrival, he was booked at Twin Towers Correctional Facility. Medical evaluations and intake processes followed standard protocol. His fingerprints were scanned digitally, matching historical records from his 2003 misdemeanor case. Everything aligned. For the detectives, the sense of finality was measured. They did not celebrate. They documented. The case summary submitted to the district attorney's office exceeded 400 pages. It included photographs of the evidence box, original crime scene logs, and every laboratory report since 1988. By late 2020, preliminary hearings confirmed sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Media coverage remained limited due to court restrictions during the pandemic. Proceedings were delayed multiple times, but the case remained active. Daniel attended remotely via video feed when permitted. The prosecutor's opening statement emphasized endurance. This case is not about a single night. It is about the 30 years that followed, years in which truth waited for science, Through 2021 and 2022, pretrial motions continued. The defense attempted to suppress genealogical evidence, citing privacy concerns. The court ruled that all procedures had followed lawful authorization. Every step, from DNA extraction to familial matching, had been documented and approved. Angela's name reappeared in court filings, her photograph displayed during hearings. The image, a simple portrait from her teaching records, reminded everyone that beneath the layers of forensic detail was a life once lived quietly. Outside the courthouse, the air was still. The sound of footsteps echoed across concrete as journalists packed their equipment. Few interviews were given. Most coverage ended with a single sentence: trial pending in Monrovia cold case murder. For the investigators, the breakthrough marked both closure and continuation. The process of justice, once stalled, now moved forward deliberately. Every stage was anchored by evidence. Not memory, not conjecture, but measurable fact. Years of silence had condensed into a single line of data, a genetic pattern stored in a computer, connecting past and present. From that connection came the arrest, and from the arrest, the possibility of closure. The photograph of Angela, faded yet intact, was returned to her brother after its courtroom presentation. He placed it beside the small candle in his home, where the flame flickered faintly in the still air. The trial of Victor Reyes began in January 2023 at the Los Angeles County Superior Court. Proceedings were quiet, procedural, and tightly managed. Decades of waiting had condensed into a courtroom filled with folders, photographs, and quiet resolve. The prosecution opened with forensic evidence. The lead DNA analyst from the Los Angeles County Regional Crime Laboratory explained each stage of extraction, how microscopic traces from 1988 had survived, and how modern amplification made comparison possible. Jurors listened attentively. The defense did not dispute the science directly, but questioned chain of custody continuity. The analyst responded calmly, citing records of every seal, transfer, and signature dating back 30 years. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of overhead lights. Detective Laura Mendoza took the stand next. Her testimony outlined the re-examination process, the recovery of the box, the DNA submission, the CODIS entry, and the eventual genealogical lead. When asked about her reaction upon learning of the match, she answered simply, "I thought of the family first." Daniel Reyes testified briefly. His statement was direct. He described growing up without his sister, watching his parents age without answers, and the weight of each passing year. His words were quiet but steady. "She deserved to be found," he said. The courtroom remained still. Even the judge paused before thanking him for his composure. The defense presented no witnesses. Their argument focused on the lack of direct eyewitnesses and the possibility of contamination, though none was supported by forensic review. The prosecution relied entirely on physical evidence and motive. The disciplinary report from 1987, recovered from school archives, provided clear connection. The handwritten note by Angela, faded but legible, established prior conflict. Closing arguments summarized 3 decades of investigation. The prosecutor stated, "Evidence does not forget. It waits." That phrase echoed what detectives had known all along. Patience was the bridge between the crime and its resolution. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the afternoon of February 14, 2023, they returned their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole. Reyes showed little reaction as the verdict was read. For Daniel, the moment brought a sense of gravity more than relief. He sat still, hands folded, as the judge thanked the jury for its service. When court adjourned, he remained seated for several minutes. The sound of footsteps echoed as people filed out. Only when the room emptied did he stand, look once more toward the bench, and leave quietly. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. He declined interviews, offering only a short statement. "My sister can rest now." The conviction marked the final chapter of the case. For law enforcement, it represented the success of forensic evolution and the persistence of evidence integrity. Internal memos later cited the Reyes case as an example in training manuals for DNA chain of custody preservation. The procedures developed during the investigation became part of the department's cold case policy going forward. In the months following the trial, the City Council of Monrovia formally acknowledged the detectives, technicians, and analysts involved. The recognition ceremony was brief, held in a small meeting hall under fluorescent light. Daniel attended, sitting near the back. When Mendoza was asked to speak, she declined the podium and said only, "This is for the family." After the case closed, the evidence box was resealed and stored again, not as unfinished work, but as completed record. The label was updated to reflect the conviction. In the quiet of the storage facility, the box joined others marked "Resolved." Cold air drifted between the rows of metal shelves. The ripple effect extended beyond Monrovia. Other California jurisdictions revisited unsolved homicides with similar forensic potential. Laboratories received renewed funding for backlog analysis. Across the country, departments cited the Reyes case as an example of how even partial samples could yield results with advancing methods. For Angela's family, life slowly normalized around memory rather than uncertainty. Daniel maintained the scholarship fund and attended each award presentation virtually. Students continued to learn her story, not as tragedy, but as testament to endurance and integrity. He kept one small ritual. Each October, on the anniversary of her death, he visited Monrovia quietly. He stopped by the school where she had taught, now renovated but still recognizable. He stood near the courtyard garden where her plaque was placed, brushed away a layer of dust, and left a single flower. The air was often still, the faint sound of children's voices carrying from nearby classrooms. The legacy of the case lived not through drama, but through diligence. It reminded investigators that no file should ever be considered final until every possibility had been exhausted. It reminded families that silence, though painful, does not always mean absence of progress. And it reminded the public that science, when paired with patience, can restore truth even after generations. By the summer of 2023, the Monrovia Police Department had reopened 7 additional cold cases using the same protocols. Detectives credited the Reyes investigation for setting procedural standards. In a published departmental summary, one line captured the spirit of the program. Evidence has time on its side. Angela's story became part of a quiet collective of solved cold cases, narratives, that rarely reached national headlines but resonated deeply with those who understood persistence. Forensic scientists occasionally referenced her case at academic conferences as an illustration of long-term evidence integrity. Each mention carried respect, not spectacle. Years later, the original photograph taken in 1988 still hung in Daniel's home. The colors had faded, but her expression remained clear. Every detail, the light through the window, the calmness of her face, reminded him that her story had finally been heard in full. The house on Cypress Avenue still stood. New residents lived there, unaware of the history beneath the paint and flooring. Yet for those who remembered, the quiet of that street now carried a different weight. Not fear, but closure. In the final departmental review, Mendoza wrote a short reflection at the end of the case summary. Evidence does not age. It waits for someone to listen. The words were later framed on the wall of the Monrovia Police Department's cold case unit. Beneath it hung a single photograph, Angela's portrait, restored from the original negative. The caption read only, "Resolved 2019. Cold cases often close not with revelation but with calm certainty. Justice, though delayed, arrives without noise." Outside the station, the wind pressed gently against the glass doors. Inside, the light stayed on a little longer, illuminating the shelves where other stories still waited.